Hello everyone, and welcome back to another cartography lecture video. And in this lecture video, I want to begin our discussion on labels. So in the previous video, we spent a lot of time talking about font sort of properties, and how we can use those properties to make meaningful decisions. And after dealing with the title, the next most important place where we typically find font is actually in labels. So to make clear, when I say a label, what I'm talking about here is just a piece of text that is associated with a particular feature, typically in the main element, that is giving some sort of descriptive information. So for example, you could imagine if you had a road network, you might want to include labels that give the name of each road. If you had school districts, you might want to name the school district. Or if you had, say, points that represent major cities, you might want to give the population of each of those cities so that the user has this information readily available within the main element of the map. So hopefully that sort of makes sense as to why understanding labels is extremely important to making an effective layout. And there's really two key things that we have to talk about with labels. The first is going to be which type of label you use, and the second is going to be the properties that you use to set up that label. And that's going to be things like whether or not you include a halo, label placement. So I'm going to break those two things into two separate videos. This video is going to talk about the label types, and then the next video is going to talk about label properties and placement. So in this video, we're talking about labels, and again, we're going to be talking about the three types of labels. Now, to be clear here, this is coming from an ArcGIS Pro perspective, so these terms are sort of specific to that software. Other softwares might call things differently, but again, we're talking about this from an ArcGIS Pro perspective. And in ArcGIS Pro, there are three types of labels. The first is going to be graphic text. The second is going to be annotations. And the third is going to be what's called dynamic labeling. And I ordered them in this way because they're ordered in terms of how much they relate to the data. And I'm going to take a little bit of time and go through each of these, describe what they are, how they work, and explain some of the pros and cons to using each of them. So first we have graphic text. Graphic text, sort of fundamentally, is just a text box. Right, this is no different to when we used text box to add titles and reference text. It's that same sort of approach. We're literally just setting text onto the main element to relate text to the data. Now, the nice thing about doing this is that it doesn't care about the data, right? It doesn't change. You set the point size, maybe you want 10-point font, you put it somewhere inside of the map layout, and it's going to stay there. It's not going to move. It's not going to change size. It's going to be consistent. So they do not change. So put another way, right? Labels do not change. Size or position. And that can be really important if you're in the final stages of producing a map and you want a piece of text to go in this very specific place and say this very specific thing. Graphic text is great for that because once you place it, you know it's not going to change. The other thing that's critical here is you get a strong freedom of placement. Now this freedom of placement is going to make a lot more sense after I'm done talking about annotations and dynamic labeling. But basically, graphic text is one of the only options you have that can actually be placed outside of the map frame that the labels are referencing. So annotations and dynamic labeling are bounded to that map frame, and if you try to move them outside of it, they'll disappear. So if you needed to put a label towards the bottom of the layout, but the map frame stopped, you would actually lose annotations and dynamic labeling, whereas graphic text can be moved outside of the map frame. That'll make a lot more sense when we go through some real-world examples. Now, the con of this is sort of similar to the labels do not change size or position, but to say that more as a con is that these labels are not dynamic. And what I mean by that is they don't change with the data. And I'm going to give you an example of why this might matter. So let's say that you're working with a road network, and just like before, you decided you wanted to make some labels that show the names of the roads. And you've made this map. It's an online map, we'll say, for ease of distribution. It's an online map. And a year later, the person that provided the data set comes back and says, hey, we've updated some of the road names for various reasons. We would like that to be reflected in your online map. With graphic text, in order to do that, not only do you have to change the database, but because they're not connected to the data, you actually have to go in and change each label individually to make it match any changes to the data set. So let me repeat that. With graphic text, any change to the underlying data has to be manually updated in the graphic labels. Similarly, if you have any change in scale, right? Again, labels don't change size or position. So if I place a label somewhere and then I decide, oh, I want to shift my map frame so that the data is moved over slightly to the left so that I see more of this region or less of this region, right? The labels aren't going to move with them. So you would have to manually go in and click and drag to move that graphic label over to where you want it. Also, if you zoom in or out, right, there's a general rule that you don't want your text to dominate your hierarchy, right? Think back to that visual hierarchy. You don't want your text labels to dominate the features. And so if you zoom out to make the map a smaller scale, right, lines get thinner, points get smaller, right? If your text stays the same size, because again, they don't change size or position, you then have to go in and manually update the size to resize all the fonts to make sure that they're appropriately sized relative to the data. So I know that was a lot. Let me just kind of give you a second, and then I'm going to recap the points. The idea with graphic text is they're great if you know exactly what you want to do or if you need some freedom in terms of placement. But their big con is that because they're not connected to the data, any changes that you do to the data, whether it's names or the data changing, or if you're changing position and scale, have to be updated manually for each individual label. So that's graphic text. Again, it's basically just using a text box to provide the label for the data. The second type of label that we come across often is annotations. Now, annotations have come a long way from their early days. They're actually a lot easier to work with now than they used to be. But they do still have a couple of sort of strong characteristics, both in favor of them and also against them. So basically what an annotation is it's a label that is created at a set scale, but can change location based on the data. So it's connected. So annotations are labels that are connected geographically to the data, but do not scale. And sort of what I mean by that is if you pan the data left or right, or up or down, the annotation label will move with it, so unlike the graphic text. But if you zoom in and out, the annotation text will stay the same size. And that's because when you make an annotation, you specify what scale you actually want that text to be referenced to. That'll make a lot more sense when we go through the real-world examples. But basically, annotations have a fixed size, but not a fixed location. Actually, you know, let's do this. So our three types of labels, we have graphic text, annotations, dynamic labeling. Graphic text is fixed size, fixed location. Now what I'm saying with annotations is they have a fixed size, but a flexible location. Right? They're connected geographically, but not to scale. So they will move with the data, but they won't change size. So let's talk about some of the key features of annotations besides the fact that they don't change size. One of them, again, as I just said, is that it will move with the data. Or should I say relative to the data? So again, if you pan your data set around in the map frame, the annotation labels will move relative to the data, which can be really helpful, again, compared to that graphic text. You don't have to do everything by hand anymore. Another key feature of annotations, and this is as opposed to dynamic labeling, is that you actually have fairly strong capabilities to edit individual labels. So it's easy to select and edit individual labels. And what I mean by that is, let's say you have some labels that have been placed onto your map at a certain scale, and you see that there's some conflict of placement in terms of things overlapping, or maybe they're too close to features. With annotations, just like with graphic text, you can actually go in, select individual labels, and then move them to wherever you want. Now the nice thing with annotations is that they're still connected to that data, so relative to that feature, they're going to move as you move the data around. So if I slide something, if this is the data, right, and I have a label here, right, with graphic text, if I move this point, nothing will happen. This label will stay in the same place. What's nice with an annotation, right, so if I move, let's say I move here, right, the label is still going to be here. Right. With annotations, right, if the feature is here and the label is here, and then I move to here, right, the annotation is going to move right along with it. Now the nice thing with an annotation is, let's say that I wanted the label to be farther up. I could do this. I could click on the annotation and I could move it up here. Right, so now there's a little bit more distance. And then if I move the point, right, if I move the point here, the annotation label is going to stay in the same position relative to that point. Whereas with the graphic text, right, I could have certainly moved the graphic text, right, that's not a problem, but if I moved the point, the graphic text would not go with it. So this is the key feature. This is the key feature of annotations, is you have a lot of creative freedom over individual labels, but they still maintain the relative positioning to the data. So if things change in the data set, things will also change in the annotation. Whereas with graphic text, right, you have that same level of control over the placement, but they don't dynamically move when you change data around. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's go back to talking about annotations and some of their pros and cons. Right, they're easy to move relative to the data, they're easy to select and edit individual labels. Unfortunately, they are created at a set scale. And again, right, once you create them, they're created at a set scale, which means they're going to be the same size regardless of whether or not you zoom in or out. So they'll move with the data, but if you change the scale, the labels might seem inappropriately sized. So that's annotations. The last form of labeling, and this is probably the one that you're going to be using the most, is going to be dynamic labeling. So dynamic labeling is actually the default in ArcGIS Pro. So whenever you right-click and go label, it's going to by default use dynamic labeling. So let's talk about what dynamic labeling does differently from annotations. So the key difference with dynamic labeling is that it's not only relative to the position, but also the scale. So in this case, right, the labels, how did I word that up there? I want to keep the wording the same. The labels are connected to the geography, but also the scale. And what I mean by that is, just like with annotations, right, if we move the data around, the label will move with it. But unlike annotations, if I change the scale so that I zoom into a larger scale map or I zoom out to make it a smaller scale map, the font sizes will dynamically update so that they're always more appropriate for the given size of the actual data than an annotation, which again is created at that fixed scale. So the key thing here is they change size. That's one of the key uses of dynamic labeling, is they change position and size. They change position and size as the data changes. Again, just like with annotations, they're dynamically updating. So if you have an issue where something in the data set changes names, like again, if you have a road layer and someone changes the name of a road, all you have to do is update that name change in the data set, and it will automatically be pulled through the dynamic labeling into the label itself, so that you don't have to worry about keeping track of changing things in multiple places. Another key thing with dynamic labeling is that it provides a lot of options or parameters to quickly edit many labels all at the same time. So it provides options and is set up to edit many labels at the same time. And so again, because this is the default, when you turn on label, what dynamic labeling is going to do is it's just going to throw labels onto every feature, unless you specify with like a SQL query or some sort of arcade function. It's just going to throw whatever field you call onto all of the features. So it gives you options to be able to edit the labels of all of the features. So this is sort of the contrast that you have to annotations, is that dynamic labeling deals with all of the labels, Annotations give you the power to really hone in on individual labels and move individual labels around. Dynamic labeling, you don't have the capacity to really edit individual labels, especially their placement. So that's really the con of dynamic labeling, is it's very hard to change placement or wording of individual labels. Now, what I will say is this. Dynamic labeling, just like annotations, has come a very long way from when it was first implemented. And so you can actually do a lot more with dynamic labeling, especially in the recent versions of ArcGIS Pro, than you ever could before. So really, dynamic labeling is going to be your workhorse. If you get into a situation where you have specific labels that aren't doing what you want them to do, then you would convert those to annotations and you would move them around manually. So hopefully this makes sense. I know there was a lot. I'm going to go back through really quickly and just recap what we've talked about. So in this video, we covered the 3 types of labels. We have graphic text, which is a text box which has a fixed size and location, and a fixed text that is only editable through the text box. Next, we have annotations, which are a fixed size because they're generated at a specific scale, but they're flexible in location, and generally speaking, they update with changes to the data. And then we go down to dynamic labeling, where dynamic labeling connects everything to the data, so both in terms of the location as well as the size. So they're able to more accurately reflect changes to the scale and location of the data. However, dynamic labeling really prevents you from doing individual edits to individual labels. So in reality, what will end up happening when you make your maps is you're probably going to use the majority of dynamic labels, convert some things to annotations to be nitpicky in terms of individual labels, and then finally use your graphic text for certain situations where the other 2 just simply don't work. Hopefully this made sense. In the next video, I'm going to talk about label properties and placement and give you some general best practices. And then we're going to end this module up with some sort of how-to videos using ArcGIS Pro. So hopefully this made sense, and if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.